Good morning, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Palestine Remembered. Rob, we've got a fantastic person joining us today, a fantastic bloke out of the US. He's a historian of Palestine, Dr. Zach Foster. Good morning, Zach.
Good morning. Thanks so much for having me.
I really appreciate you joining us. Zach, why don't you give us a little bit of your journey to Palestine? How did you come to Palestine?
So I grew up in a Jewish household, in a Jewish community, attending Jewish schools, going to Jewish Zionist summer camp, attending Jewish youth group events, going to Israel with my Jewish youth group. And so I was raised in this Zionist Jewish environment. And I think that's what got me interested in Israel in the first place. And then when I went to university, I started to learn the historian's point of view rather than the pundits or propagandists' point of view about the history of Palestine and the politics of Palestine. And that got me really interested in the history of the Palestinian people, because what I learned at university contradicted and conflicted with the stories that I was raised with. And that was really across the board from things like there's no such thing as a Palestinian people, the famous Golda Meir quote that you've probably heard many times, to very much the modern politics around Yasser Arafat and how the Palestinians famously, quote unquote, never miss an opportunity. So I was raised with all these points of propaganda, and they very much stood in contradiction to the historian's perspective that I studied at university. And I think that's what got me more interested in Palestine was that disconnect, was that cognitive dissonance. And that led me to pursue graduate studies in Palestinian history and ultimately a dissertation on the history of the name Palestine itself. When did people use that term? In what contexts? For what reasons? Where? In the Middle East, in Europe, in the United States? And then also, when did people start to call themselves Palestinians? And why? And what was it? What were the historical developments and processes that led people to start calling themselves Palestinians? I would say those were the two main questions that I focused on in my dissertation research.
Zach, increasingly, you're an embodiment of young Jews moving away from the concept of Zionism, white supremacy movement. You're the embodiment of that. Take us through that journey. Couldn't have been easy to go from youth camp and shul and very Zionist, quintessential upbringing that you've had to where you are today.
It was definitely a process. It doesn't happen overnight. I would say the first murmurings for me personally of that cognitive dissonance that I had mentioned was when I traveled to Jerusalem as a study abroad student. I was interested in studying in my quote unquote homeland. I wanted to improve my Hebrew. And so I enrolled in an Ulpan, which is a Hebrew intensive language course generally taken by new immigrants and new Jewish immigrants. And so I'm in this Ulpan with actually many Palestinian students from East Jerusalem who also were trying to learn Hebrew. And this was the first moment, the first encounter that I can remember of meeting Palestinians face to face, learning about their stories, getting interested in their backgrounds, hearing about what kinds of things they had to deal with just to even get to campus. And so this just got me so curious, first of all, because I just knew nothing. I was just an open book, right? I had no prior knowledge aside from all the propaganda about who these people were and what their stories were. And so I started meeting them. Like first we met practicing Hebrew together, but increasingly I just grew more interested in Arabic. And so started doing some Arabic exchanges with them. And then I would say that was the first domino to fall. The second thing that happened for me personally was that led me to then start reading more about the Israel-Palestine conflict, more from a critical historian's perspective. The new Israeli historians, maybe you've heard that term thrown around, people like Avi Shleim, people like Benny Morris, whose politics are a bit problematic, but leave his politics aside, but the history that he's written on the Palestinian refugee issue. Obviously, Ilan Pappé, the author of The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, one of the most brilliant books ever written about the 1948 war. Noor Masalha, who wrote a very interesting book on the lead up to the 1948 war and the Zionist thinking leading up to it, and how many Zionist thinkers were planning or thinking about the concept of expelling Palestinians already for decades before 1948. This was a topic that had come up really continuously over the previous decade among Zionists. So I started reading this history and getting much more familiar with the Zionist narrative, which was incredibly problematic from the very beginning. And so that was, I think, the second domino to fall. And then I would say the third thing that happened was that I went on this program, half Palestinians, half Jews, with a program called Abraham's Vision, which is, I believe, now somewhat defunct. But at the time, we went to the Balkans, Serbia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Croatia, Kosovo, and we traveled around the Balkans as part of this comparative conflict analysis program in order to de-exceptionalize Israel-Palestine, to say, hey, look, the Israelis and Palestinians are not the only people in conflict. They're not the only people fighting over land. Let's try and de-exceptionalize this conflict, try and step outside of our own comfort zone and try and understand what's going on in the Balkans, why Serbs, Bosnians, Croatians, Albanian Kosovars, why they were killing each other in the 90s. Maybe that will help us understand what's going on in Israel-Palestine. And so I would say those were really the triggers. And then after I finished my undergraduate degree, I got so obsessed with trying to learn Arabic and trying to just immerse myself in the Arabic-speaking Middle East. Lived in Jerusalem for a year, lived in Syria for 6 months, went back to Israel-Palestine for another 6 months in Neve Shalom wa Hat Salam, and from there I went on to pursue my graduate studies. So I would say that's sort of the short story of how I got into Israel-Palestine from, say, the Palestinians' point of view, or more of a, let's say, historian's point of view, a more critical point of view than from the one I was raised with.
Jack, I was just going to ask, just going back to when you started to find out about whether you'd been lied to, what were the feelings when you actually did find out that everything you'd sort of been taught growing up was not true? Did you feel that you'd been lied to?
Oh, no, absolutely. I felt like I had been lied to. And I think that feeling of betrayed or deceived was very much what led me to go so deep into Palestinian history and studying the broader Middle East. It was precisely that feeling of yeah, like here I was totally unaware of what was going on. And even my first couple of years at university, before I had really started to become more critical, I was part of the pro-Israel organization, right? Like I was all in. I was very much part of my identity because I was open-minded and because I actually just wanted to know the history and wanted to understand what was really going on the ground, that my eyes were opened up. But most people, I think, generally speaking, just don't have that kind of open mind and are sort of not willing to really check their own assumptions and challenge the stories and narratives that they were raised with. But absolutely, I very much felt lied to.
So, Zach, one of the realities, the community is very sticky, quote unquote. It's not easy to leave. And then I can only imagine the vitriol that was thrown at you in the extended community for taking this position.
No question about that. Look, my brother's a rabbi. We grew up going to shul every week. When you go to shul in the I would say conservative, lower C conservative, when you go to shul at these synagogues, like my shul, for example, they would pass out flyers to congregants to donate to the Friends of the Israeli Defense Forces. Okay. There was no separation between Judaism and Israel at the synagogue. To be a proud Jew, to be a believing Jew, a praying Jew, a practicing Jew meant to be pro-Israel. And so I think that the first time I really was just absolutely disgusted was when it was 2008, actually, was the first moment I remember feeling that like extreme outrage was when I think it was the height of, it was July 2008 was when there was that Hezbollah war with Israel. You know, the entire American Jewish community was just, 100% behind Israel. And so here we were in a synagogue, in a sacred place of worship, where I'm supposed to connect to God and feel spiritual and have a spiritual experience. Here I was being inundated with politics. It just felt so grotesque. I think that was another, I would maybe call it the fourth or fifth domino, was feeling that outrage. That definitely led me to, I think, become even more anger and even more hostile to sort of Zionist narratives.
Your family, how's your family taking it?
But we've already realized that Israel-Palestine politics are not a healthy topic of conversation within the family. And so we've just tended to avoid it altogether, I think, has basically been the status quo for many, many years now. And very occasionally there'll be a moment where there's like a lapse in judgment. And this happened just actually a couple of months ago. If you recall, there was that recent flare-up in Gaza. It was just a month or two ago.
Yep.
And Israel was dropping bombs, as it always does, on civilian populations, committing war crimes, as it often does. My brother kind of casually, I was with my family at the time, we're on a family vacation, and my brother just casually asked, so what do you think about the situation? Kind of nonchalantly, very casually. And, I wasn't going to deflect the question. I was happy to talk about it. I'm always happy to talk about it. It's just usually they're the ones who have realized it's probably not a healthy conversation to have for the family. But yeah, I was like, well, it's pretty obvious what's happening. Yair Lapid has an election coming up. He is going to be facing off with, Benny Gantz, who bragged about sending Gaza back to the Stone Age, but essentially bragging about committing war crimes. So you have this new prime minister who's younger, who doesn't have the military background and military experience, is trying to compete with Benny Gantz. He's trying to compete with, obviously, Bibi Netanyahu, and he needs to bolster up his security credentials. And so the obvious move for him is to bomb Gaza, because that's going to make him look strong in the eyes of the Israeli public. And the same was true, I would say, not just Yair Lapid, but also Naftali Bennett, both of them are trying to boost their security credentials at the cost of tremendous Palestinian loss of life and suffering. Literally, innocent Palestinians are dying so that Naftali Bennett can win a re-election, or so that Yair Lapid can win a re-election. I mean, the grotesqueness of this. And so this is the conversation I'm having with my brother. And at some point, obviously, I think he realized like, oh, let's get back to talking about, I don't know, falafel and hummus or whatever we were talking about. But yeah, it's obviously a very, very sensitive topic and we just don't go there anymore.
I'm sorry about that. Back to the Balkans, you're saying that the whole concept was to de-exceptionalize Palestine, Israel, and say other people fight over land. I mean, I'd be interested in your thoughts. I mean, the reality as we see it as Palestinians, Israel's a colonial enterprise. Whereas in the Balkans, this isn't a colonial experience that fight there.
That's a great point. Yeah. There's definitely some very important differences. And I completely agree with you that I would not describe the situation in the Balkans as a colonial situation. However, there are some parallels with what Serbia did to Kosovo in the 90s and 2000s, right? So there are many parts of Kosovo that experienced an influx of were essentially Serbian settler colonists. So you had these Serbian populations that were essentially transplanted from Serbian mainland. And so there are some parallels in terms of, again, I would say specifically with regard to Serbia and Kosovo, where Serbians talk about how, the Battle of 1389, this is, Kosovo is part of historic Serbia, right? Like Israeli Jews would say similar things about Judea and Samaria, as they would call it, right? Where this is part of our historic homeland. And so there are certain parallels that can be drawn. But I would tend to agree with you that there are obviously some important differences as well, including maybe the broader settler colonial context.